To get into the video game industry is a fickle beast. You have to tame that beast correctly to get into the right scope. It doesn't just mean to be successful, but it's hard to get into that beast no matter what. Companies like Nintendo and Sony have managed to stay relevant in the video game industry for more than 30 years at this point. And have still making games that have been successful for a long time. But at the same time, it's an industry that can rise a lot of rise and fall stories. We've already seen this with companies like with Rareware, and in the future we'll see with Atari and Konami both having these different rise and fall stories. However, the most significant rise and fall story is probably one we all know of. In fact, if you're a 90s kid, you grew up with this company. That company is Sega! Yeah, you know, eventually we get to Sega in this podcast. And as such, Sega is a company that had a meteoric rise in the 90s. But just as quickly, that fall tapered them down to an exactly a different way. Hey, and today we're gonna be going down the history of Sega. Sega during its rise and fall. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going Thomas 45 or Thomas Martin 45. We're going on the phone podcast, and this is the rise and fall of Sega.
Okay, Smokey, roll 'em.
It's showtime.
Everyone's mad.
While Sega's origins can be traced up to the 1980s for video games, the origins start a lot earlier than that, back in World War II. Sega's origins began in 1940 when three businessmen Irving Bloomberg, Martin Bromley, and James Humpers formed Standard Games in Honolulu, Hawaii. The aim to provide coin-operated amusement machines and slot machines similar bases to increase morale in World War II. These were to create entertainment for the troops who were often suffering through vicious and cruel tactics during this time. After the wars ended, they continued to make the scene more and more services for the military usage. However, in 1952, the U.S. outlawed slot machines for territories. This included Hawaii at the time. Hawaii would not join the United States as a full state until 1959. So that's just want to let you know. Hawaii. Okay. A year later, Bromley would send two of his employees, which is Stuart and Ray Lemire, to Tokyo, Japan, to establish service games in Japan to provide coin-operated slot machines to the U.S. bases in Japan. A year later, all five men established Service Games Panama to control the entities of Service Games worldwide. The company, over the next several years, would distribute to places including South Korea, the Philippines, and South Vietnam. The name Sega was a local term. It wasn't the official term just yet. The term came from the name of Service Games, and its first clock machine was Diamond Star. However, due to its notoriety in the criminal business practices of the 1940s, 50s, the Service Games Japan was dissolved in 1960. June 3rd that year, Bromley established two companies to take over business activities. I'm hoping I pronounce these right, but they are Nihon Garaku Busan and Nihon Kayako Senso. I'm hoping I pronounce these right. I am not a Japanese speaker. These companies were purchased all of Sega Japan's assets. Keiko Seiza doing the business of Sega Inc., focusing on manufacturing slot machines, while Goroku Busan did business under Star Wars under Atomic Inc. To distribute coin-operated machines and jukeboxes. The companies merged in 1964 but retained the Nihon Garaku Busan name. Around the same time, a man named David Rosen had launched a follow-up for a booth business in Japan in 1954. Became known as Rosen Enterprises in 1997, and began operating arcade games in Japan. In 1965, Nihon Goroku Busan acquired Rosen Enterprises to form Sega Enterprises Ltd. Rosen was installed as CEO in 1966 and becoming the first. Shortly afterwards, Sega stopped leasing the companies to military bases to move over onto more slot machine and coin-operated machines. These included regular jukeboxes, pinball machines, and gun games. Due to them manufacturing second-hand arcade machines, well, they had a tendency to break down a lot easier and required frequent maintenance. Reconstruction of replacement flippers, guns, and more caused Sega to lose some of its own money. However, they decided to reformat by making a very ambitious game with the first ever electronic mechanical game called with a submarine simulator called Periscope, released worldwide in the late 60s. Although there is no exact date for this thing. It features lights and sounds and was successful in Japan. Due to the expensiveness of this unit, though, it wasn't really made for the commercial small boom. Instead, it was mostly used in malls, department stores, and other places in the Europe and United States and help standardize the 25% cost of these arcade units. Sega was honestly quite surprised that this thing even was a remote hit. And for the next companies, they was focused mostly on games like this to help out. The worldwide success of Periscope actually led to a technological renaissance in the arcade industry, which reinvigorated the way by way of audiovisual EM and novelty games that led to in the wake of Periscope in the 1960s and 70s. However, rapid piracy led Sega to cease exporting its games around 1970. In 1969, Sega was sold to the conglomerate Gulf and Western Industries, although Rosen still remained the CEO. In 1974, Gulf and Western made Sega Enterprises Ltd., a subsidiary of the American company renamed Sega Enterprises Inc., and released Pawn Chuan, the first video game in 1973. This helped lead to a boom of video games in the 1970s. Helped out by titles arcade game Space Invaders. By 1979, the arcade business, mainly Sega's arcade business, had revenues climbing to $179 million. During this period, Sega acquired Gremlin Industries to manufacture processor-based arcade games. With again, I might remember this, but Esco Bluesky, I think, I'm not sure how to say this. Just a coin-based company owned by Hayao Nakayama. Nakayama was placed in the management role in Japan's offices. In the 1980s, Sega was in the top 5 arcade manufacturers in the United States. As the company's revenue rose to $214 million. Seeking games like Head-On, which introduced the Eats the Dots concept that was popular enough with Sega with another game later on, Pac-Man, and licensing Frogger, most successful game at the time. In 1982, Sega introduced the first ever game with adventure graphics. The 1980s followed a bit of a downturn in the arcade movement in that era. At first this idea might seem successful. The downturn meant that they had to change tactics. Gulf and Western sold the North American rights off in 1983 to Bally Manufacturing to license arcade games. Gulf and Western still retained the North American R&D operations of the Japanese subsidiaries. Sega's Inc. With arcade business in a steep decline, Sega President Otoshi Nakayama advocated for the company to use hardware expertise for the home consumer market. Okay. In the early 80s, home consoles were starting to get a bit of notoriety, thanks to the success of Atari's 2600 and later on the ColecoVision and Mattel's Intellivision. However, their first attempt was not successful whatsoever, as their first attempt was known as the SG-1000, a small game console released in Japan in July 15th, 1983. While this idea was revolutionary, the company initially thought they could easily get good soldiers with this first console. Unfortunately, they were in for a rude awakening that time, as Nintendo released a console called the Famicom that same year. In fact, it was on the exact same date even. With the Sega now realizing that they might have just shot themselves in the foot, but they didn't know how to do it. So, well, the SG-1000 sold 160,000 units compared to the 50,000 they have projected early on. It was unfortunately outpaced by Famicom, large part because Nintendo counted third-party developers, while Sega was heavily to collaborate with other companies which was competing arcades. In 1983, Rosen announced that he stepped down from the company of Sega President, and Jeffrey Rochilis was announced as the new president and CEO of Sega. After the launch of SG-1000 and the death of the company's founder Charles Bloodhorn, Golden Western and sold off secondary businesses. Nakayama and Rosen arranged a managing buyout of the Japanese subsidiary in 1984. With financial backing aggregated computer services, a prominent Japanese software company. Sega Japan were purchased by $38 million by good investors led by Rosen and Nakayama. Asaya Akawaka had a CC made champion, and chairman, when Nakayama was installed as a CEO of Sega President Ltd. Around the same time, they remade the SG-1000 as a new console called a C-3000, a more advanced version. However, when Nintendo announced that they planned to move these with the console in the United States, it became a dire warning to Sega. Despite launching with the more console, they were about to get a rude awakening in the US console market. The US console market and video game market was dying. A video game crash in 1983 was already being installed, and by 1984, the market had lost a lot of its luster. Unfortunately, launching a video game this year was just stupid, as it would really just bomb. Not only people no longer play video games nowadays, but also seemed to be a less box-effective manual. Many people were unsure if they should ever release video games during this time. Sega was oftentimes also scared too. However, there was a bit of a helper in case, a Trojan horse if you will. When Nintendo announced it was releasing it, they realized that the video game console also had this issue too. So they redesigned it to make it look more different. Instead of loading games to the top, they would load games from the side. And instead of marketing this thing as a video game console, they marketed it as more of a cool toy. Using Rob the Robot and the Zapper. The Zapper was a sort of futuristic, just a gun-like toy. While Rob the Robot gave it kind of a unique futuristic vibe as well. The Nintendo System released in 1985 and it became a huge hit, revitalizing the video game market of that same time. Sega, realizing this, redesigned their system as a redesigned SG-1000 and called it Mark III, the third version of it. For North America, they decided to rebrand it to the Master System, with a futuristic design to appeal to Western audiences. After the same was released in Japan in October 1985, that being more powerful than the Famicom in many ways, it was unsuccessful at launch. As Nintendo required third-party developers not to publish their own games for on other consoles, Sega developed its own games, monitoring the rights to port games from the developers. To help out the American market, Sega wanted to at least see how a toy would be done, asking for Tonka to do the manufacturing for them. However, that idea quickly fell through. Okay? Tonka was not successful during this time. Okay? Marketing was poor with them, and their experience with Kenner, which greatly manufactured the company's loss to them, made Sega manufacturing the SG-1000 at a collective loss every time they sold a unit. By 1980s, Sega had fallen to third place with this whole idea of the console, with the Nintendo Twist System comfortably taking the lead its first year. Yeah. The Atari 7800 was following the second place. Master System was well to third place thanks to the poor marketing of it all. Okay? Tonka's ineffective marketing handicapped the sales of Master System. Listen, okay? But by the time that Nintendo, the time 1986 came around, it was always seen that Master System was already inferior to the NES in many ways. The sales in Europe were a lot more successful. Master System was actually very successful in Brazil though, which was surprisingly there. Okay? And then, however, in 1980s, it seemed that it would not have to work, so they expanded offices to even more places. Sega opened its European division of Arcadians in 1984 called Sega Europe. It re-entered the arcade manufacture in 1985 with the establishment of Sega Enterprises USA to end the deal with Bally, with the release of Hang On in 1985. Okay? It proved successful in its reach as well, because it was so popular that Sega kids with band. You have Okacho was released in 1985, and even one more successful, so a Claw Machine Games. Until 1986, Sega Records was established to manufacture the company of games, with Master System being the first time. Sega Records cut back account marketing vision with the console, focused on consumer profit on focusing on games. Outrun was released in 1986, becoming one of Sega's best-selling arcade games ever. Former Sega Akira Nagai of Hang On Outrun helped pull Haymarket down out of the Outrun in 1982 as they decided to make more games. With the arcade market once again growing, Sega was now known as a new talent. However, it was seemingly down to when a new innovations were coming around. Now, the innovations of the Sega 2000 was not to be messed. However, by the time the Master System was being sold out, new innovations came in Japan. In 1987, AC introduced the PC Engine, the first ever 16-bit home console. So, while it became a huge successful integrator in 1987. Realizing this, the companies realized that they had a new competition with better specs in the market. It would have to come through quickly though, and they were devoted to this and had to figure out how to come quickly to get through this all done. The arcade business was growing with racing games and side-scrollers. However, Sega had to diversify the trade. Nintendo announced that they were making a 16-bit console around the same time, hoping to get released by 1989. Sega decided to finally release it their own first console with a new console called the Genesis. On Master System itself and the drive in 1980. However, the launch was overshadowed by Nintendo's very own Super Mario Bros. 3 a week earlier. Okay? Only being shipped 40,000 units. However, in 1989, the news broke that the Nintendo's 16-bit console would not be released in 1989 or 1990. This gave Sega the greatest benefit of all: time. Sega was was damn proud of this new idea, and it gave plenty of time to release it in 1989. Yes. Instead of going to the Mega Drive, they changed it to the Genesis, making it much more impactful with how big it was going to be made. The advertisements were made to be more aggressive. With no release of a 32-bit console, they made the console go for a different name. Instead of Mega Drive, they changed it to Genesis, and made the commercials seem gravely different, saying that the Genesis was what Nintendon't.
Genesis does.
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Collins free.
Genesis does.
What Nintendon't?
Buy a 16-bit Genesis system between now and October 31st and get an extra.
Then the Sega Genesis was much more of a sale base of how to market a console effectively. A much more way of making the thing go down. Because Nintendo owned console rights among years, Sega actually had a bit of a different idea. Make the consoles more about the American market. Making games that involved famous celebrities at the time, like Joe Montana's football or Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. Making it, but adding to its first bit of at least some notoriety. Although Sega still had overwhelming difficulty of acquiring homes. By 1989, Sega America only sold 5,000 units of Genesis. Haruo Nakayama had in mind with gold. The launch of Genesis also meant they needed a new mascot. Sega looked to the character Mario. To see how about. And see how he can provide their own character. Okay? The previous mascots have failed to be stopgaps in the whole idea. Okay. The first mascots, Ox Kid and Opa Opa, were seen as mere stopgaps in development. While both were successful enough to at least get some decent games out of them, they were seen as mere either imitations of Mario or a space shooter. Ox Kid famously was not popular with the crowd of Sega fans, seen as a blatant above of Mario at the same time. With the Master System not being place and in place. With the Master System itself getting discontinued in 1992 in America, although being popular enough in Europe and other areas. They decided to make a new mascot with a new personality. Original ideas include a rabbit character with ears that get grabbed called Feels the Rabbit. Unfortunately, this never got past the drawing board, and it was seen as too obvious. They also tried a humanoid Teddy Roosevelt style character. However, the design was not appealing to Sega creators. However, they did really revise this version for it, making it the main villain, Dr. Eggman, or Dr. Ivo Robotnik in the US markets. Instead, they decided to make an animal that was something unique. Initially going for a porcupine design, they changed it to be a hedgehog design. The character was to be named Meows. The character was initially meant to have a design. Right. The idea was to give him a blue pigmentation, as the Sega logo itself was blue. His clothing design was given a red and white livery like it was by Santa Claus, and boots with color red, giving him an appearance of being a blue hedgehog with boots. The boots were modeled after Michael Jackson's attire on his signature album Bad, released back in 1987. And his personality plays off of Governor Ugly Sauce at the time, and then later on President, now on 1992 presidential candidate, and later on winner Bill Clinton's Get Done attitude. To help get the idea down on the high ups, they designed him to have a cool idea. Sega America's main manufacturer, Michael Katz, did not like the idea of some ideas. Initially, the question why Sonic was blue. Why did Sonic have a girlfriend named Madonna? He asked, would the real Madonna actually sue us for having a girlfriend with that name? why is Sonic in a rock band? Why the hell is he a hedgehog? It does seem to raise a lot of questions for him. However, that decision would not last long. As in 1990, Cats was spied from part of and soon afterwards, toy manufacturer Tom Kalinske came into the scene and made some significant changes to Sega's popularity. By the time Tom Kalinske came in, he changed Sega's model to be a lot more difficult. Seeing this game as most successful it was, he improved a lot of designs. They did scrap some designs later on, like Sonic being in a rock band and his human girlfriend Madonna, but it came up as a huge marketing draw that same time in a draw. How Tom Kalinske added some new marketing ideas, including packing in Sonic the Hedgehog with the Genesis and slashing the price of Genesis down from its initial price. Well, the board was disapproved. However, Nakayama did approve of this idea. He told Kalinske this: "I hired you to make decisions for the Europeans and Americans. So go ahead and do it." Right. In a large part of his popularity of Sega Genesis, of Sonic the Hedgehog, the Genesis outsourced big part of the Super Nintendo system in 1981. On its holiday season. In 1992, Sega controlled 65% of the 16-bit console market. Sega sold Nintendo for its 4 next collective years. Due to the Genesis head start, lower price, and large library of games for the SNES originally, Nintendo's share of 16-bit console dropped to 60%, and to 37% by the end of 1983. Sega claims 55% of all 16-bit sales during 1984, and the Genesis sold supreme out there. However, they had plans to expand their console manufacturing in the area too. In 1990, they released the Game Gear, a full-color console. Handheld consoles were always starting to get some notoriety thanks to Nintendo's Game Boy. In 1989, Atari released the Lynx, the first ever color backlit console. However, it being a battery hog, along with the fact it couldn't hold a charge, made it unfortunately a flop in the marketplace. Sega wanted to get a game console in there, calling it the Game Gear. The Game Gear was meant to be the antithesis of what the Game Boy was. Instead of a monochromatic screen, it would have a full screen in color. Instead of having no backlight, it would have a backlight. And it would be almost like a handheld Genesis at the same vein, where the Game Boy was scaled down and watered down. Unfortunately, this did not make a lot of stuff. We had a weak battery life, lasting for on average of 7 hours. It had a lack of original games, and had weak support for Sega overall, only selling 11 million units. But it seemed to do well enough to get the idea down. Now with the success down, the Genesis versus Nintendon't ads were retired entirely, and instead, the Sega Genesis ads were marketed by how cool they made Sega, saying it has technologies like blast processing.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do? And what if you don't have blast processing?
Or saying that was the market share of cool.
Young Bobby Engels has a problem. He needs to earn the respect of his peers. So he gets Sega Genesis, the ultimate action system. And then he buys Mortal Kombat, the arcade edition, and the all-new Shinobi 3, and Marvel's X-Men. Now, things are pretty much okay.
I said chocolate chip. Say it. Say it.
Cool. It made everyone see the talk of town. They're so ready to tackle the next bit of the market too, and want to make the next big manufacturing bust of the 90s. The CD market.
Hey! You still don't have a Sega CD? What are you waiting for? Nintendo to make one? You have seen the games, right? Wrong answer, man. Show 'em. Want to see more?
The Mega CD, or the Sega CD as it was in areas, was officially tapped in 1991 in Japan. However, not more technically until 1982. The game itself, first games were very much different. However, it didn't seem to notice how much the idea was. So they made sure it would work regardless by making it much more simple to manufacture than advertised. The Sega CD was meant to be a big tester to see how it would be there. With it being released in the 90s, the CD album was already a huge case of how to make things work out well. Marketing the Sega CD, though, was initially a hard idea, it being one of the very first CD-based consoles out there. NEC had introduced TurboGrafx CD in 1991. However, it did not seem to make a dent in the marketplace. Because of this, NEC didn't make any games for it. Sega was hoping to make the CD a lot more valuable too. Shortly after Genesis' release, they made sure to make the games more stuff. According to Kalinske, Sega was ambitious about the CD-ROM technology with the video games, with the potential for movie-like graphics, rock and roll concert sound, and 3D animations. However, some changes were made to the add-on. Because the Genesis and Motorola 68 GB CPU was too slow to handle these games, an additional 68 GB CPU was incorporated. This gave the CPU clock speed of 12.5 MHz, faster than the original 7.7 MHz of Genesis. A response to this was also an NEC memories for TurboGrafx 16 between 0.5 to 2 to 4 MB, increasing the CD's popularity. Due to technical challenges and the CD's RAM space was too slow, developers found it a bit harder to make games for it. Sega partnered with JVC, which had been working on the Warner Media, to help develop the CD player in STG format. Sega America was not informed of the project details until 1981 for some reason. Despite planning manager Chad's documents early in the year, the American division was not given a functionality test until the 1990s. According to film director Michael Latham, when you work at a multi-country company, there are things that go well and there are things that don't. They didn't want us to send us the CDs, working CD units. They wanted to send us the dummies and not send us the working CDs until the last minute because they were concerned about what we would do with it. And if it would leak out. It was very frustrating. Latham and Sega has licensed the idea to Shinobu Tsunada in 19 acquire the CD-ROM technologies and dummy units. It was former senior producer Scott Bayless said this: "It was designed with a cheap consumer-grade audio CD drive, not CD-ROM. Quite late, in the run-up launch, the quality assurance team was severe problems with many of the units. And when I say severe, I mean the units literally burst into flames. We were on the clock trying to catch a failure in progress, and after about a week, we finally realized what was happening. The problem was that it was overheating the motors. They changed the motors out, and the launch was at least impacted in the 1990s. Okay? Sega initially released CD in 1991, although its market in the US was slower to manufacture than others. Okay? And especially only 20,000 units of Mega CD were released. Third-party development took a hit during a long time to release development kits. But factors didn't help also that it was a slow process to add on. Well, the idea of having a 3D made people realize that the Sega CD was kind of an up and down journey, making games that were more mixed to the fan base. And making games that were different stuff. In the 1990s, Sega continued to make more and more with its arcade units. unfortunate stuff. While Sega CD didn't prove to be successful at first in the Japanese market launch, when it hit American shores, it seemed to be able to do a lot better. Thanks to Sega Genesis' renewed success in the Japanese market, marketing Sonic the Hedgehog, and its sequel released at 1992, a third game was released for Sega CD as a sort of a midway point. The second game introduced Tails, and the third game introduced Amy Rose and Mel Sonic as new foes. It seemed that things were somewhat upward trajectory for Sega. But let's see how they keep that console boot down after the break.
Oh yeah, I'm feeling the love.
You feel the love. But what's your name?
Gary Payton, but they call me the glove.
How you feeling tonight?
Yo, I'm feeling the love.
Feel the love.
Sonic! Yo, Sonic! Man, stay off the light speed.
My bad.
Sonic Adventure on Sega Dreamcast. It's thinking.
Welcome back. We were just talking about the Sega CD and how it fails. However, by the time the CD and the industry was obsessed with a new creation, bits. The bit industry may have not been successful, but it was successful enough to know that it was now a business that people were now starting to go through, and so to say, it was impactful. In 1993, Atari released the Jaguar to consumers, touted as the first of a 64-bit console. In its advertisements, Atari urged customers to do the math.
Some of you believe your system is the most advanced in the universe. Let's review the numbers. Sega Genesis is 16 bits, 3DO is 32 bits, the Atari Jaguar is 64 bits. Which is more advanced? Clifford! With 64 bits, 3D graphics, real-world animation, and lightning speed that you can only get with Jaguar, which is more advanced? Clifford!
Can you repeat the question?
Jaguar! Jaguar!
It was a fierce idea and a dig at consumers. The Jaguar overall didn't sell great, but it sent a message hard to the leading companies. Another console that came out at the same time was a 3DO, a 32-bit console that was developed by some of the companies, including Panasonic. By 1984, another company console was the Amiga CD32, a 32-bit console developed by Commodore and Amiga. In 1984, a buzz was going around Sony when it released its own console called the Sony PlayStation. Sega initially asked them if they could help out with some games, but after fear of development ideas, they decided instead to reject Sony's deal, thusly Sony to make this PlayStation on their own. Sega was incredibly scared of the 32X, these new 32-bit consoles, and asked to make their own 32-bit consoles. This included their next big ambition, the development of the Sony console was initially touted as a 32-bit Genesis. However, when it was brought back over, they initially hated it. Okay, Joe Miller started this just a idea as just a horrible idea. If you're gonna do is enhance the system, you should make it an add-on. It's a new system with new hardware, great, but the only thing it does is double the colors. Miller, for his part, doesn't remember being quite that blunt. However, the message was there, and as such, they made the idea as a bit of a game. They both decided to include a 32-bit console add-on. Initially, the idea was titled Project Mars in development. For marketing, it got weird. While Sega was known for edgy, in-your-face advertisement, the marketing in this swing was surprisingly sexual, and talking about how the 32X mounts the Genesis. By the time it came for release in 1984, it was already seen as a bit of a what-the-hell machine. When it was advertised at a television show, a rapper took the stage, but the music was too damn loud, and people were already confused on what to do. When promotion release of the 32X, it virtually did not do anything to help graphics in Japan, as Sega already announced for their own console to be released in time, the Sega Saturn. Sega 32X, though, was to hit the market in North America on November 23rd.
Machine has appeared in homes across America.
Double and redouble his power. 32.
6 times more powerful than 3DO.
Alright, baby.
40 times more than Super NES.
Hey, yo, there is no 32-bit Super NES. Are we gonna see the games or what? Show me!
Increase the power of the unit 40 times.
Thank you.
First, 1994. However, that market launch was anything but a good idea, as during that same time, it did not make the console any much more of a success or failure. By the time that the Sega 32X released in the market, this whole bit boom had burst. The Atari Jaguar was always seen as a failure, and adding a CD-based attachment to the console made it even more of a joke. The 3DO's price was a major contention point. The 3DO was overpriced and underhyped. The CD32 caused Commodore to close down in 1984, and the Sega 32X major console looked ugly as hell. It gained a nickname as the Sega Mushroom. Mushroom. Which, looking at the console itself, it didn't matter. Not only that, but there was a voltage systems come hella high water in the main markets. And unfortunately, it did not matter if you were a good console or a bad console. The 32X made the console look silly. Okay? By the end of 1994, the 32X Genesis add-on was unfortunately not a good. Unfortunately, was a rapid issues, and the biggest on the face was coming from Nintendo, and at the same time, when they released Donkey Kong Country on the same day, a game that rejuvenated the Sega 32 market that they had lost Sega. The opponents chose innovation, but Nintendo chose a damn fun game. It didn't help also that all these companies were so cocky with their behaviors, coming off as immediate assholes to the game industry. Okay, the 32X unfortunately tapered off in 1995 part of the season. And unfortunately, there were a lot more internal problems too. The 32X already has unplugged. Adding an additional plug made the console more confused, but they were not only less values when the Sega Saturn in Japan was already being released. By 1985, the Sega 32X was discontinued in Japan and was sold at a sold price of $19.95. Thanks to Sega decided to focus on the new console, that being the Sega Saturn. The idea of the Sega Saturn was already enticing more to consumers. While the 32X seemed more like a mere stopgap, the Sega Saturn was at least something they could go off of. A home console that could easily still work. A premier idea was to make the console being much more experienced. And after its release in November 1994 in Japan to relative success, it seemed that they wanted to get it out in America in September of that same year. However, fear was soon growling at the door. When Sony announced PlayStation would also hit stores in 1995, Sega got cowards. They thought themselves, we should probably release it early. Okay? They got a message, and Sega Japan wanted to release this console earlier. Japan mandated an early launch for the Saturn to take advantage of the PlayStation. The American consumers were kind of perplexed at this idea. Okay? The Saturn wasn't popular at the PlayStation in Japan. However, the PlayStation quickly cloned up to be more sales. They didn't know if they should carry on with this, but Japan's forceful marketing told them that this was the best way to get the console out and the best consumer market. Secretly, the console was shipped out to manufacturers, including Toys R Us, Electronics Boutique, Software Etc., and more. KB Toys signed on to also asked results of this. However, they decided not to pay this instead. And the design announced it for a new release in 8 coming up. In 1985, they went to a consumer show to show off a bunch of its systems, systems, big new patches.
Who gives you raging arcade gameplay? Who gives you the most authentic sports games? Who gives you a game that lets you fly? And who gives you access to the internet on your TV? Play games, surf the net, only on Sega Saturn.
By then, they announced on May 11th a showcase of the games and showed the Sega Saturn we have for $399. But the shock came to everybody that day. When its release, the date was going to be on July 8th. So, and said that the Saturn was out now and people could buy it right then and there. This idea was a terrible idea for many people when they realized this. Was an immediate shot in the foot. When they released the Saturn early, it gave companies little foresight on what this thing even was. There have been rumors and reports that companies didn't even know that this thing was coming out at all. And companies like Walmart and Best Buy immediately tapped out and said no to this. They weren't waiting for a new console by Sega. They weren't informed ahead of time. This disastrous idea of launching the console early may have been working on consumers, but the idea was far from good. By the time that this whole idea came around, it fumbled any chance of it becoming a name in its home console markets. Okay. By the time the Saturn released in 1995, for all its years, the launch of it was always so bad that that most of the game companies don't. Harming sales even more was that it only came out with 6 launch titles. Virtua Fighter gained relatively lacked popularity in the West. Not long afterwards, the PlayStation released on September 9th. Was a huge marketing campaign. PlayStation also announced something that was much bigger. The number heard across the world.
Steelways, join me for a brief presentation. $2.99.
That's right. The price of PlayStation would only be $299. Now compared to the $399 that the Sega Saturn was make the PlayStation a lot more desirable to consumers. That whole new number made a digital grab for PlayStation. And it made the Sega Saturn realize one thing. Their idea of launching early was not a good idea. The launch was a disastrous idea. By the holiday season that year, they changed the whole thing to go down in price of $29. Only PlayStation 2 beat them to the punch by scaling their console down to $199. By the time that Nintendo announced the Nintendo Entertainment System, Nintendo Entertainment System successor, Nintendo 64 to compete with PlayStation, Sega had made a monumental error in their judgment. Saturn initially did get good games. However, it did not. However, the whole idea of the Saturn's launch crippled any success they had with other successors. In 1985, so they even tried to make it a Sonic game with a game called Sonic Extreme, the first ever 3D platform of Sonic. However, once it was taken to markets, the Sega crew did not like how it tested. It ran poorly. They asked for changes immediately. By the time the changes came back, they realized that the game was unrecognizable to what previously become. And instead, they cancelled any release of the Sonic Extreme right then and there, leaving the Sega Saturn without a premier Sonic title. An unheard of idea for a main manufacturer. No game of your main franchise mascot? What the hell was happening at Sega was now a big question. Now, the Saturn would get good games, and would get some titles. However, they released the console way too early, and unfortunately, business decisions made it more and more of a question mark in the whole market. There was, in 1996, Tom Kalinske left Sega for different prospects. Kalinske did not like the idea of going to the company. See, a former executive down. After 1996. However, instead I'm going to say my time probably. Soichiro Imahiri was appointed to CEO when Kalinske after he left. Imahiri had already worked in the Sega himself. Bernie Stoclair, former executive, the Park Council, became Sega's executive vice president and in charge in production development in that time. Stoller was not supportive of the Saturn and believing its hardware was poorly designed. While Stoller had said the Saturn was not the future, he continued to emphasize the quality of games. Unfortunately, when Nintendo released Nintendo 64 in 1996, Sega had now bumped from second place in the development era to third place. While 32X may have been a failure, it was merely just an add-on. Sega Saturn was a main console. It was not an add-on at all, and it caused a bit of a whoop. Sega did not realize it before, but they were making a console that was just outright silly. It made them come off as cocky and arrogant. They had to figure out something quickly. In 1997, they announced that the Saturn would be discontinued that next year. With Sega only being third place now, the Sega Saturn was seen as a popular. Soon after the Sega Saturn was launched, a new console was now being made. Sega manufactured the Sega Saturn to a loss each year due to its expensive hardware, being a PlayStation, and its terrible launch year. And they had to change that, up to make a new console to become a huge name and to recapture the success there. So, what did they do? How about reformation of the console? Because focusing on trying to tap into the next console that year. Yeah, with the next console, they would title.
This is the day you have trained for, the day you have studied for. Utilize your superior skills, your superior intelligence.
Sit down, rodent!
Sarah, baby? Oh, you were one fly.
Don't make me hurt you.
Learn to defeat your ruthless enemy, Steve of Hackensack.
Ryan, you're gonna get rude.
Shut up, quadruped.
Sega Dreamcast. It's thinking.
Dreamcast. The Dreamcast it seemed intriguing. Being the first console to include to really emphasize the boom of analog graphics after the Nintendo 64's main gimmicks. Introducing mainly good games afterwards. Knowing that the sound was a setback production not too high, Sega took a different approach entirely to Dreamcast. Unlike previous Sega consoles, the Dreamcast was designed by its talented systems and proper workwear, with selections of hardware closer to computers and consoles, reducing cost. This enabled software to begin and any about they can be implemented. Sega informed its game developers with the Pentium 200 would run console. According to Damien Pefferon, the motherboard was masters of clean, uncluttered design and compatibility. The Chinese Communist mentioned Chairman made the console with at least somewhat there. With this new motherboard intact, they made sure that this console was at least somewhat profitable. Now it's time to see what to do. So they made sure to release it at a time when no console was thinking of a new console time, giving it at least somewhat of a window to at least get somewhat open. The idea was still preferable. However, there was a few catches they had to make sure not to get down in the end. The Dreamcast was released in November of 27, 1998, with the early stock being sold out immediately. While it wasn't as huge a success as others, it was seemingly much better. Now it's time to see how to go change up the developments and try to tap it for the American market. Dreamcast was now ready to become a bit manufacturing tough. But as the clock ticked to the 21st century, it would change up drastically. As it would lay itself above for what would happen later. The seeds of Sega's first attempts came in the 2000s when, however, its seeds of the Dreamcast's first of not being successful came in 1999 when Sony announced PlayStation 2's release hit the year 2000. Already, Dreamcast would have a big competitor. The Dreamcast itself was already a slower competitor, but it seemed to do a lot of the issues Saturn would. For one thing, it had an actual Sonic game with Sonic Adventure. It also had an actual multiple mascot at the same time. In ways, it connected to the internet a lot better within the Saturn's failed attempts and more. However, by the time it was going down, unfortunately, Sega had confirmed that Stoller had been fired in 1999, where PM Moore was now hired 6 months. Sega America's executives only 6 months prior. Dreamcast released in America in 1999 with 18 games. Sales rated by selling 225,000 units in its first year alone. Making it alone, at least seemed to be doing well, possibly, and it seemed to do well in the holiday season. However, sales immediately started to decline that next year. As early as January, declining was already happening. And on March 3rd, the PlayStation 2 would be released that same time. Not only that, but announcements came around at the same time of new console manufacturing themselves. Nintendo's GameCube was announced that year, their first disc-based console. And Microsoft planned to enter the gaming system console market too with a console called the Xbox. Sega's initial momentum plummeted quickly when it hit the new millennium that same time. It didn't seem to matter. Sega had realized that they were getting closer and closer to not really getting much out. When they released the console at that same time, it didn't seem to notice that the 2000 market was now much slower. It seemed odd. How were they almost prepared for this? But now that the console is now coming back up even more, Sega America realizing that the working sales of Sega's arcade users. Not only that, but overall, sales of Dreamcast were only harbored by small impacts. The arcade business Sega was doing was a decrease as well as its computing business. Morgan president in 1990. In May 8th of 2000, he said Dreamcast would sell 5 million units by the end of 2000 to remain viable. However, it only really sold up to 3 million units. Moreover, Sega had spur its Dreamcast sales at lower prices and cash rebates financial growth. By March 2001, by the end of the year, Sega had fallen behind even more. Eventually, Sega came up as a big problem. In 1990, well, unfortunately, the main thing in Sega announced a big change in the whole market of the idea, and announced that they would stop making consoles in the middle of 2001. Sega Dreamcast has to be the last time they've ever entered the console market around the same time. The whole idea of the new boom for Sega was there, and by March of 2001, Sega announced that they would stop making consoles entirely. The Dreamcast will be discontinued on March 31st, with the last set of games being planned to be in 2001. By the time it ended in 2001, Sega had finally exhausted all its gas in the console market, and instead asked to become a home manufacturer of other materials instead. Nowadays, Sega exists as a third-party manufacturer and have made consoles for games for other companies. However, we're gonna stop here, as I think that it's better to end Sega off during its prime and heyday. It's been able to climb back up in its own way, but to say Sega was back to its original self is far from true. Sega is a weird company in terms of making their own idea and business ideas. When it came to the console market they were small but they were big. However, thanks to small ideas in the 90s, they became the big name that they all started to know, thanks to Sonic the Hedgehog and slashing the price of Genesis. However, Sega soon learned a cautionary tale. Once you're at the top, the only way you can go is down. With the release of the Sega 32X being a mere stopgap, the release of the Sega Saturn's terrible launch pattern as well, it made them drop from the top all the way to third place in the marketing. And by the time the Dreamcast released, while it was good by many fans, and it still has a permanent fan base to this day, it was a little to recoup the success of what Sega had beforehand, thus leading Sega's unfortunate slidings down to become a major problem. Today, Sega exists as a large standing company, but it also serves a cautionary tale of rising too fast and too high for developers. Before we end off, I'd like to remind you all where you can watch this podcast. You can watch it on YouTube, Spotify, on Amazon, on Apple, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Please subscribe to my Patreon and you get podcasts for $15 a month. And please follow me on Bluesky as we get updates to this podcast. Until next time, I'm GoToms45 or Tom Kalinske 45, and I'll see you all later.